So here's a few news articles. This guy won the $3 million prize, the biggest prize apparently in academia, called the Breakthrough Prize, that came from Mark Zuckerberg and a few other people. And what he has done is he has figured out an improvement in stochastic analysis, which tries to figure out how random things work out. There's a famous quote, I think, from Einstein that said that this is the most difficult problem in the world, the behavior of fluids, turbulent fluids. And so he has figured out some way to mathematically analyze these apparently random operations, and that will move you forward into a whole new field of math. So that's a good thing. And it is a very puzzling time in America. The entire country seems to sort of be in a cult group, or at least the leaders and the supporters of the Republican Party. And I've seen this before. I've known a lot of people in religious cult groups. I've been in them myself, where you just believe a lot of things that just make no sense at all, and the people outside can't understand. And so here they're showing that half of American and 73% of Republicans believe at least one false thing about the coronavirus. And so here, for example, is hydroxychloroquine that doesn't work, but half the Republicans believe it works. 36% of them believe that a face mask will harm you. I've heard a lot of people try to say that and justify that. 13% believe there's a cure. 32% believe that a mask will not protect you or protect others, which you can certainly see. It is very interesting, and an interesting issue of psychology, because all those things are clearly wrong, but we're not getting anywhere convincing them. So there's this app you can put on your phone called Giggle. And I saw on Twitter a couple of days ago a bunch of people getting really mad and posting angry exchanges with the owner of this company. And I didn't really understand what was going on. But because I've done a lot of Android security already, I, of course, installed the app and tried to see if there was some obvious security problem. And the main thing I noticed is the main point of this app is for women only. And the first thing it does is try to make sure that you're a woman. So you have to take a picture, and then it will decide if you're really a woman. And you can't even make an account unless it decides that you're a woman. And so I found a magazine cover with a picture of a woman on it, tried to hold that in front of the camera, and it didn't fall for it. But anyway, so I didn't get beyond that point because I sort of lost interest. I did a couple of simple tests before that, and it passed them. But what it turns out, it's been going on since July. And it turned out the person that made this app apparently has some problem with transgender people, which is part to do. You have to be a woman. You have to be a real woman by whatever her standards of what a real women are. So anyway, even if you get in, after you manage to take a good enough picture and convince it that you're a woman, then somebody did a study and they found that it had a vulnerability, which is very much like the University of Houston app that I was talking about this year at DEF CON, among other places. If you go into the app and catch the traffic with BERT to see what it's doing in the middle, then when you try to view a user in the user list, it has this filter. You can filter by name and you can filter by somebody's phone number, and then it will find them. And of course, not only that, but when it passes the data up to the server, it doesn't just pass the phone number, which is processed on the server, it passes an equals, a command which runs on the server. And this is amazing. I've only ever seen one app do this badly. When you pass something up to the server, it has to be data, which is then processed on the server. If you let me pass data like not equal and equals, then I'm passing a command up to the server over the network. And so I can just simulate that traffic somewhere else. I can catch it in the middle with BERT. Now I can pass commands and execute them on the server. You're not ever supposed to accept commands from an end device that's under the control of a user. All you accept is data, and all the commands are put on the server by a developer and cannot be changed. So of course, this means you can change that command and execute arbitrary commands on the server. This pretty much hands remote control of your server to the attacker. And so they found that it was also had the vulnerability insecure direct object access. They could go see things that you aren't supposed to see. In particular, one of the things they tell you right at the start is when you first have to take this picture to prove that you're a woman, they say, don't worry what you look like. Nobody will see that picture. We won't save it anywhere. And they're totally saving it somewhere. And you can just find it. You can see all the pictures people took, which were never supposed to be shown to anybody. And the point is, apparently, inside the app, there's a bunch of really sensitive stuff. Like a lot of these people are in fact sex workers, and they have a special chat for sex workers to talk about that. And there's clearly means there's other groups in here. There's groups in here with information that is really personal that they really don't want leaking to unauthorized people that could really mess up their life. And so this person tried to warn them. And once they've done it, now they try to tell them. And so all they got was the typical kind of abuse you get from founders. I've done a bunch of this, notifying people who have not asked you to do a security audit, and generally nobody wants to hear it. And a large portion of people have no comprehension of what security is. And this is one of that category. So she says, you guys are idiots, insults them. We have a security team. There's nothing wrong with our app. It's 100% secure. You're just some kind of bum trying to attack us and stuff. And they couldn't get anywhere. They were also able to, they also found out that when you delete your account, it does not remove those stored pictures it was never supposed to store at all. They're just up there forever, which is true of a lot of things. Anyway, so then you tried to tell them and just got a lot of abuse, and it took months. The only reason why this is all public is that after like 3 months of arguing with these idiots, they managed to get them to fix something. And so anyway, it's another example of a well-known fact in the industry, which is that if you check some app and you find a flaw, the most professional thing to do is to not tell them at all. Just let them get hacked. I tell them, but if you do, you take a big risk for no reason. They're likely to blame you, punish you publicly, try to threaten you with lawsuits, contact your boss and try to get you fired and all that nonsense. So if you want to do that, you have to have a lawyer and be careful. The only things you should be testing are apps that have like a bug bounty program, where they have a program saying, we invite you to test our security and here's how you tell us. Then it's at least safe and you won't be just punched in the face for telling them. Anyway, this one I thought was amazing. This is the cloud native interactive landscape. These are all the products and protocols you use to manage cloud services. And this is just sort of mind boggling. And I've seen similar things for people that run security in enterprises. You have an anti-two-factor authentication, an anti-phishing product, a remote control product, a VPN product, until there really are like 100 or 200 companies. And you're typically running 10 or 20 or 30 of these things. And they're all made by different people with different updates and different requirements until you just kind of go mad trying to organize them all. And this is the mind-boggling complexity of our business. If you think you know a lot, you will rapidly be humiliated, saying there is so much more to know. Who are you fooling? You don't even know half of this. You don't even know 10% of this, and you never will, because they're always adding more. So that's one of the things about this business. Anyway, I thought this is pretty amazing. This is apparently real. I wonder if it was a fake video. They apparently made this thing. It's a suit just like Iron Man. The backpack is lifting him up. The arm things are used to steer, and off he goes. And I don't imagine he can really fly very far or very high with this thing. But there was a event last week where an airplane was coming into land, and another 2 airplanes coming into land at an airport said, we just passed some guy on a jetpack flying around where the airplanes are, getting in the way. And they're like doing research, trying to find out who that was. So apparently these things are really coming here. I don't imagine they're for sale commercially or very practical yet, but they're coming. And since this is the crypto class, I think the last one I'll talk about is the Raccoon Attack. TLS, which is the protocol used for HTTPS for secure web traffic that we're all using, has a variety of vulnerabilities with names like Lucky, 7, and Crime, and Beast, and all of them, by the way, are not extremely large risks. So you'll find an awful lot of websites have not updated their TLS certificate, and they're technically vulnerable to some of these, but all of them are pretty impractical. And here's another one. In principle, it's a flaw in TLS. In practice, it's not the end of the world. But this is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which we're going to talk a lot more here, where you move these cryptographically calculated numbers over an insecure network, and you compute a secret from them, and hopefully a person in the middle who can sniff those numbers you sent over the public network is not able to deduce the key. And so anyway, he has a side channel in TLS 1.2, which is not the very latest version, but 1.3 is the latest version, and a lot of people are still using 1.2. And he found a flaw in the structure, this team did, which is that you generate a secret, and then for some reason you remove leading zeros from the secret before using it in further computation, which is what you might do if you were trying to do mathematics on a piece of paper where you have 000 1000 and you drop the zeros, but there's no reason to drop it here. And in fact, if you do drop it here, that creates a measurable difference in some place where you have dropped it and some place where you haven't dropped it. So they're able to tell if the first byte was 0, which might sound like a small problem, but it isn't. And we're going to do the padding oracle attack. If I can get information about the key, even information about 1 bit or 1 byte of the key, then all I have to do is be very clever, and I can use that to pump out the whole key, and that's what they did. If I can ask thousands and millions of carefully chosen questions of your cryptographic protocol, I can sort of roll the code through so that that little window I'm seeing a small piece of the key through moves around until I see more and more of the key. And they showed they can, in principle, break the whole thing entirely by doing many, many requests here. And they say, they talk about how serious it is, like all the rest. They say, don't totally panic. It's really difficult. You'd have to be in the middle. You'd have to run a lot of exchanges. But in principle, it's a mathematical flaw, and they should patch it. And apparently, they've fixed it in the latest version of TLS. So anyway, that's cute. All right, we're up to the official time here. So let me get down to here. All right. I should mention that in about 2 weeks from now, there's a discussion board, a Canvas server. You should be putting up discussions. If you look at the schedule, they're already due. You should be discussing one on, and I'm going to add one here. It should be going up later today, probably. It might already be up there. In a couple of weeks, I want a discussion where you tell me what you think of the course. I've had students having great difficulty with the online courses. They have no good internet. They have no good computer. They can't get the virtual machines running, a lot of problems. And if you have any problems, come to any of my classes. Connect to the Zoom is usually the best way to get help. But anyway, I really want to get some feedback to see what's happening with people. Most of them show up. They either don't come to the lecture at all and just watch the video, or they show up and they don't say anything. And that is your right, but I do want to put a discussion board where you have to say something. And to make sure that people feel welcome to complain, you have to fill out a form, which is what we do for faculty reviews. You have to say something good and you have to say something bad. So there's no point pretending that you can get by without saying a bad thing and worry. Nobody's going to get punished for complaining. I want to know what's happening. I'm sure people are having troubles, and I'd like to know about them so I can try to do something about them. So anyway, watch out for that. I'm putting that in all my classes, and I hope I can use it to improve the classes. Anyway, so let's talk about cryptographic security, which is here. All right. So let me make this big. All right. Shove these other things out of the way. All right. So we're going to talk about how strong cryptographic protocols are here. We have to have some way to measure them, and that's the point of this chapter. It's not any specific routines that are that important here. It's going to lay the groundwork for how we move forward. And this is why you do cryptographic attacks. Almost all the cryptographic attacks, like that one we just talked about, the Raccoon Attack, do not actually manage to get into a modern version of the protocol in practical terms. And so you might say it's a waste of your time, but it isn't, because you have to rate how difficult it is to get in. And so you do things like weaken the cryptography until you can get in, or figure out how long it would take an attack, even if it's going to be so long that you can't really do it. So you can compare it to other ones and decide how secure it is. And one of the cases where this really came home to me is when we had the Iowa caucus a month or so ago, or maybe 3-4 months ago, and the Iowa caucus used an Android app. And people said, this Android app isn't secure. And then there were copies of this app flying around, and I got a copy of the app and tested it. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, this app is what I would call a secure app. I have like 3 or 4 simple tests I run, and it passed my tests. And it's as good as, say, the Safeway app, or City College app, or any normal app like that. It's as good as that app has to be. But a voting app has to be much more secure, because a normal app, like a consumer app where you shop, is just like a website where you buy products. It's not a very high value target. If somebody hacks into your copy of that app, all they get is in your account, and they get to take your money and buy some product or something. But a voting app is going to be attacked by hostile nation states. So they might really be willing to have the world's experts spend months and years cracking in, and huge, powerful supercomputers spending huge amounts of time and money breaking in. So you have to have a much higher degree of security. So you need to be able to quantify how secure things are. And that's the point here. So what you really would like is, of course, you would like to know that your app is 100% impossible. Let's see, somebody DDoSed the phone line of the Iowa caucus. Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, that was one of the many things. Yeah, people did flood the lines, which froze up the app, and that was one of the vulnerabilities. Yeah, and that's why there were a variety of vulnerabilities. So that the Iowa caucus app, while it was up to like standard commercial standards, was not at all ready to handle voting. And real voting experts like Matt Blaze say you shouldn't be using apps at all for voting. There is no way to make them secure enough right now, or internet devices, no way to make any of them secure enough. What they really say you should do is just write on a piece of paper and mail in that piece of paper or turn it into a box and then have people look at that paper and count them up. That is the old system, and the modern system are not an improvement on it. Anyway, so what you'd really like is for it to be completely impossible. This would be great. If you can have an app, some kind of encryption routine that is absolutely impossible for anybody to get in without the key, even in theory, even if they had all the computers that could run forever. Now, there is one like that. That's the one-time pad, but it turns out to be hard to use. So what you settle for is computational security, which is not that it could not be done in principle, but it does not appear to be possible with the computers that exist today or the computers you expect to exist any reasonable amount of time in the future. And then you have to say, how many years do you expect this to be secure? Because computers keep getting better. And then you're really guessing because who knows what the future holds. So informational security is what you would really love, or even an attacker with an infinite amount of computers and an infinite amount of time could never get in. And that is the one-time pad. The reason why the one-time pad is informationally secure, if I make a message that's, say, 20 letters long, then there's 20 letters in the pad, so I'd have to try all combinations of 20 letters. Now, that's not impossible to do. You could do that. The problem is you would create all possible 20-letter messages, and a bunch of them would be readable messages. So, and you would not know which one is the correct readable message. So even if you did a complete brute force attack or trying every possible key, you still would not know what was in that message. There is no way to tell the correct message from the false messages. So that's why this one is completely secure, informationally secure. So if you can previously distribute enough completely random key bits to the other end and never reuse any of them, then you can use the one-time pad, and that's essentially perfect. But that's normally not something you can do in practice. So you settle for the lower level of computational security, which means that it can't be broken as far as anybody knows. And that's, for example, AES 128, by far the most popular cryptographic system in the world, be used by almost everything. This was the advanced encryption system recommended by the US government. It's designed both to be secure and really fast. It's the most efficient way to encrypt anything. As far as anybody knows, if you have a 128-bit random key, nobody can try them all. There is no known shortcut to do it without trying all the keys. It's really very nice. However, quantum computers, in principle, they don't exist. But if quantum computers did exist that were big enough and accurate enough, then they would be able to break this by only the square root of the number of calculations, 2 to the 64 operations to try 2 to the 128 keys. And that might be possible if you could build a better quantum computer. So people are currently worrying about AES 128. When you try to, right now, nobody can get in without the key, but in 20 or 30 years, maybe, a quantum computer might be built that could get into AES 128. So if you wanted a little bit formal, it is secure if it takes this many calculations with that probability of success. So if I use one guess at the key, I have one chance in 2 to the 128 of getting it. If I do 2 to the 64 keys, I have 2 to the 64 over 2 to the 128 chance of getting in, So if I want a chance of getting in around 100%, I would have to try something like 2 to the 128 keys. And 2 to the 128 may not sound like a big number, but it is a really, really, really big number. 2 to the 32 is 4 billion. That you can do on a computer. 2 to the 64 is 16 billion, which is really hard. And I think 64-bit is the largest key that's ever been broken by brute force. 72 is a project underway, but it's expected to take 1,000 years. And so 2 to the 128 is really a lot. It is so many that there are strong arguments that you could never, even with the whole universe running as a computer, you could never try 2 to the 128. There aren't enough atoms, there isn't enough entropy in the whole universe to ever try all 2 to the 128 of anything. So that should be fine, unless there's a shortcut. And of course, quantum computers, in principle, would provide that shortcut. So they're beginning to talk about the need to move off of 2 to the 128, move off of AES 128. So you can measure it in bits. And so this is a simple approximate measure, which is, what we mostly talk about. It's good enough practice. So if you have n bits of security, that means it'll take 2 to the n operations to crack. And you don't really know how long an operation is or how many milliseconds or microseconds. You don't worry about that. You just try to get a general scale of how big in general is the problem. So a perfect cipher with 128-bit key would give you 128 bits of security. And that's essentially what AES 128 is, if you exclude the threat model of a quantum computer. So WEP is a fine example of a broken cipher. It had a short key of 64 bits, and then it had a longer key of 104 bits. And I think it was actually 40 and 104 because there was a matter of 24 bits that were in the initialization vector. But anyway, a 104-bit key would be pretty good. That's almost as good as AES 128. That should have been fine, but there were mistakes in the mathematics. Or to be more careful, it's not that the math was done incorrectly, it's that the design was not cryptographically secure, so they were able to do analytical attacks on it and lower the number of keys you have to try. So you didn't really have to try all of these 2 to the 104 keys. In fact, the FMS attack meant you only had to try 2 to the 20 keys, which is really small. And there's a lot of, later one took it down to 2 to the 15, and both 2 to the 20 and 2 to the 15 are a number of calculations you can easily do on just an ordinary laptop computer. So by 2001, WEP was completely broken to where you could easily get in without any special hardware or anything. And that's, even though it looked secure with a long key, it wasn't really secure because there was a shortcut. And the substitution cipher we talked about. If you take the first letter, A, and you map it to some other letter, and then B, and map it to some other letter, and just pick those letters at random, you have, in principle, 26 possible mappings of A, then 25 for the net for B, then 24 for C, and so on. So the key space is 26 factorial. So in fact, that's 2 to the 88. So the substitution cipher, where you just scramble the letters and substitute every letter for one other letter, you could say it looks very secure. The key space is very big to where you never could try all combinations. But in fact, it's done in the Sunday newspaper. Children just break it with no computer at all, because what you do is you look at the output and you find like a 1-letter word. Well, that has to be I or A. You find like a 2-letter word. That's probably to or as. You find a word with a double letter, and there's only a small number of words with the double letter. And then you look at the context, like the cartoon that goes with it, and you can kind of guess a word. And after you guess a word or two, it turns into that Wheel of Fortune game where you see some of the letters and you can now guess another word by looking at the letters you can see. And in fact, that technique gets you in. So even though in principle there were 2 to the 88 keys, you don't have to try all those keys to get in. There is a shortcut. There is a procedure that will get you in much faster. So yeah, what's the decimal and the exponent? Oh, that's, because between 2 to the 10 and 2 to the, there. That's because it's between 2 to the 20 and 2 to the 21. That's all. Okay, just like any other logarithm. So a lot of these attacks do not, in fact, end up with an integral multiple of 2. They're able to deduce some information about the bits, if you like. That's all. That's just 2 to the 20.5 is between 2 to the 20 and 2 to the 21. And 2 to the 10 is 1,000. 2 to the 20 is 1,000,000. So 2 to the 20.5 is about 1.5 billion, approximately. Anyway, good. So anyway, that's this one. And all right, so RSA 2048, which is very popular. This is the public key encryption scheme and the size that is commonly in use. So the key is 2,048 bits long. And I found this quite confusing when I was starting to study this stuff. AES 128 is considered secure, but RSA 1024 is not secure. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that key is much longer. But that's because this is not just a simple random number. The 2048-bit key of RSA is in fact the product of 2 prime numbers. So you cannot just choose any 2048 bits. In fact, you will have to choose very particular numbers, so they are not all available to you. So it is not true that this has a key space of 2 to the 2048, not really at all. In practice, it's about 100 bits of security you get with 2048 bits in a public key. So this is the thing about public key cryptography. Public key cryptography solves the key distribution system. You do not need to send a secret to the person at the other end. You can put up a public key which everybody can see, and keep the private key private, and now you can receive messages. You can't send them though. The person at the other end has to generate their own public key and publish that. And if both of you make a key pair, now you can talk to each other with high security. But the punishment for that is the keys, at least for RSA, are much longer and the math is much slower. So a private key encryption, AES, is much more common and much more popular. But a public key encryption is used to initiate connections on the internet. But all you do is you use this system just to transmit an AES key, and then you use AES from then on. Just because the computations are onerous for public key encryption, but we'll be doing them in great detail later on in the course. So anyway, I was interested in this, and I observed that this said it had 112 bits of security, but the textbook said less than 100 bits. And I was worried about that. Now, your textbook author is very cool. He's actually on Twitter. You can reach him on Twitter. So I did. And I said, you know, why does one system say 100 bits and the other say 112 bits? And he said, you know, it's just not that accurate. This number of how many bits of security is really just kind of an approximate number. And he just chose different values. So that's why. So that's what I thought, but I'm glad to finally hear it from an authoritative source. The author here, J.P. Almason, is a really powerful cryptographer designing a lot of powerful techniques. It's pretty much a world authority on this, so you can trust his statement. So here's the US government's official position from the National Institute of Standards. In their publication 857, this tells you how strong different cryptography is. So if you have RSA 1024, that's considered less than 80 bits of security, and that is considered unsafe. Even now, you should not be using it, and beyond 2031, you shouldn't be using it. 2048, which is pretty much the standard these days, is considered to have 112 bits of security, and they say you can use that through about 2030, but after about 2030, we're afraid somebody might be able to build a quantum computer or something and get in there. So they say you shouldn't be using this for data that's going to be encrypted up through 2031. So that's why they announced this a couple of years ago. They said quantum computers are really coming, and we're going to specify all the rules so everybody can have a few years to upgrade. So we all should be upgrading to 3072 or longer bit keys here. And then if you have that 3,000 or more bits in your RSA public key, that is considered acceptable for the foreseeable future. And notice the foreseeable future doesn't really go that far in the future. And this is where, you know, how do you predict the future? We're trying to look 10 years ahead. And how much do you really believe you know that? How much do you believe 20, 30, 100 years ahead? They don't even pretend to know that. They just say, if you do use RSA with 3,000 bits or more, you're probably okay for at least another 10 years. And maybe another 20, 30 years, but beyond that, nobody really knows. Anyway, so then you can consider the real attack cost. If you actually want to really perform an attack, and you'd like to get a somewhat more precise measure than just these sort of general terms of how many bits of security, then you can consider whether the attack can be parallelized. Some processes you really have to do the first step before you do the second step and the third step, but others you can break into multiple parallel calculations and then use many different processors, many different computers all working together. And some calculations take a lot of memory, some just take a lot of CPU time. Sometimes you can trade with a time-memory trade-off where you make a big table in memory to look up some of the calculations so you can save computer time by using more memory. Like rainbow tables is one of the many groups there. And the other one is perhaps you have a lot of targets and you only need to break into one of those targets. So anyway, here's parallelism. So if I have 2 to the 56 sequential steps, that's much slower than independent steps. And this was DES. DES was the US government official approved system in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in the late 90s, there was an attack that used 10,000 servers across the internet for 3 months. And they just took the key space of 2 to the 56 and they broke it up into many little chunks. And all those different computers did little pieces of key space until somebody found the key. And it took about 3 months with 10,000 machines, and they were able to get in because the steps were independent and they could speed it up by using many computers. That's parallel processing. Memory is another big issue. Most simple algorithms like AES are CPU hard. They do not involve using much memory at all. They just want, like the Genome Project. Yeah, Genome Project is another perfectly fine example of a distributable process. They wanted to determine something about genomes or something about protein folding, or look for extraterrestrial intelligence by looking at a giant map of the sky for things, and you just break it up into a lot of little chunks and have every one of a large number of computers do one small chunk. Right, those are parallelizable problems. And so memory problems are ones where it has a whole lot of memory required to do the calculation, and there are various algorithms carefully designed to be memory hard just to slow them down, like Ethereum. Bitcoin largely failed in every possible respect, although it still exists and people still invest money in it. Bitcoin, in fact, did not turn out to work very well for any of the normal goals it might have. It's a strange object, and some people love it, but it did not meet any of like the 4 primary financial requirements for a means of exchange, a store of value, an investment vehicle, or other things. And one of the main flaws of Bitcoin is Bitcoin uses a hashing algorithm, and that hashing algorithm is SHA-256 of SHA-256. So the only reason why mining Bitcoin is difficult is because it needs a lot of CPU speed, and that's it. It doesn't need much memory. So all you need is the fastest CPU speed in the world, and it turns out that means you have to have the cheapest electricity to run the largest farm of many, many CPUs. And that's why all the Bitcoin mining, at least as of a couple of years ago, almost all of it was done in China, where due to like local government corruption, they were able to bribe people and get really cheap electricity, more than anywhere else on earth. So there are huge Bitcoin mines there, and Bitcoin is a race. Every 10 minutes, somebody wins the race and they get a bunch of money, and China wins it almost all the time, these Chinese miners, because they just have the most CPU and that's it. And the reason why I call that a defect is because the plan, which we talked about in the previous class, was to distribute mining around the whole world. We wanted to make it so there were all these different people mining all around the world. And they all had an equal chance to win the race. So no one country could dominate it, and they failed. So when Ethereum was designed, which is a later cryptocurrency to try to improve on Bitcoin, they made it memory hard. To do Ethereum mining, you have to have a lot of RAM. And that turns out to be better than requiring a lot of CPU. So that's the plan. The idea is that will prevent the mining from being all centralized in one location. And I'm not aware of a measure of how distributed Ethereum mining is, but anyway, the idea was to make it more distributed. And we talked about pre-computation like rainbow tables. You make a table that does some of the calculation for you. So instead of having to use the CPU to do the calculation, you just look it up in a pre-computed table. And for a lot of mathematical problems, that lets you trade memory for time. And so Windows password hashes were that way. If you look at Microsoft password hashes, until Windows XP, Microsoft used these LM hashes, which are a really old system from IBM. And those LM hashes are so short and that you could actually make a table with a lot of the math done for you. And there was this rainbow table attack that was very fast. So you could actually, in something like 5 minutes, you could crack these hashes by brute force, by just trying all possible passwords. So Microsoft switched to the NT system, which is much less susceptible to this attack because the table you need is very large. There's still some rainbow tables for Windows NT, but they're much less effective than the rainbow tables were for Windows LM hashes. Anyway, but you can still crack them online. You can put NT-LM hashes on. And what this does is it really just looks them up in a big list of pre-computed hashes. So this one was just Apple 9. You can easily crack it. But anyway, there are various other mathematical flaws in Windows password hashes, the worst one being there's no salt. So if you look here, here's a 31D6 and another 31D6. And if those are both accounts, I think they have no password at all. But if you make 2 users with the same password, they will have exactly the same hash. And if 2 people on different Windows computers have the same password, they will have exactly the same hash. So there are just master tables of pre-computed hashes for all the common passwords. So you don't even need to do the math. You just need to look them up. Just Googling Windows password hash is enough to crack it for most common passwords. And that is unnecessary, and we'll talk about better ways to do it than what Microsoft uses. Microsoft password hashes are extremely out of date. They were defined in 1993, and that is a really long time ago when cryptographic technology was much inferior. And of course, here's another thing. Suppose you're trying to break into a company. You get some hashes, and you get a whole table of, you break into something like, for example, that Chatter app, Giggle. They let me execute arbitrary commands on their servers. So I could probably execute a command and dump the whole database. So maybe I'll get a whole database of 1,000 users' hashed passwords. Now I can try to crack them all, and any one of them would constitute a breach. So you can try to be faster. You try to calculate one hash and try it against 1,000 options. Try it again. So that's another way where you might be able to speed things up. So anyway, in practice, there's typically two categories of security. There's the 100 or 128-bit ones, which are considered secure enough for normal use. And if you want high security, you use 256, twice as much, which means that hopefully you'll remain secure even if exciting things happen, like they discover a mathematical error to some extent, or they invent some exotic thing like a quantum computer, or your attacker is actually a nation state that can get really powerful supercomputers or something. This you call your security margin. You try to have more security above and beyond what you think you need. And I explain how to make a private key to communicate with partner. Yeah, there's a few questions here. Okay, to make a private key for AES, you just make random bits. That's all. It's nothing more than just random bits. You could do it with dice. Of course, in computer, you do it with a random number generator. But now you have to communicate to the partner. And that is a huge problem. You have to send the key. And of course, you don't have a secure way to do that. So you send it with public key encryption. That's typically how it's done over the internet. But there are cases where you can actually transmit it. For example, if you encrypt your hard drive with a password, you convert the password to a key, and then you decrypt your hard drive, and you never send it to anybody else. So that key doesn't have to be transmitted over an insecure medium. All right, to build a quantum computer, the requirements are really daunting. You have to have qubits, which are quantum objects, which are, now computers use normal bits, which are transistors. You just have a transistor, and it's got two states, like allowing current or not allowing current, like a diode, and you just flip between those two states like an abacus, and that's what's normally used in normal digital computers. In quantum computers, you have to have qubits, which have this gradual transition from one state to another, and these in-between superposed states. And in order to do quantum computation, you not only have to have qubits, but you have to be able to entangle the qubits. So this turns out to be incredibly difficult. In practice, what it usually means is you have to have little rings of superconducting metal carrying current, chilled down to an incredibly cold temperature below 1 degree, away from absolute zero. So it's huge, rooms full of equipment, and millions of dollars to make it. And the worst thing is the end result currently is very noisy, inaccurate qubits that in fact do not really retain their state for long. The entanglement is not really precise. They have a high error rate, like 1% or 2%, which is really bad, so that when you do calculations, you get the wrong answer often, and you have to waste time trying to find the errors and correct them. So in practice, they can in principle factor numbers, but they can only factor numbers like up to 35, which is ridiculous. So right now, they can't do much of anything too exciting. Although Google claims that they've just recently got ones that do certain very strange problems a little bit faster. So they would have to get a lot better, like 1,000,000 times better than they are, to actually be a risk to cryptography, but they might. They're improving every month. You see a thing going forward. So anyway, that's the thing. And of course, but in order for quantum computers to ever become a significant risk, they need huge improvements in the hardware. They need to be able to do it at room temperature with some kind of chip that you can mass produce, and they need to be much more accurate. And people are working on that very vigorously. WEP is only good for regular computer. Well, WEP is not really good for anything. WEP is pretty much a waste of your time. You can crack it with almost anything now. The original point of WEP was to get people to use wireless transmissions in the 90s, when wireless networking was new, and it was considered better than no encryption at all. And it was better, but it wasn't much better. So example of hash math model to break password. I'll show you some. We'll talk about a few of those a little later. You got some projects where you're going to go through a lot of these attacks. So that may help. Good. Those are good questions. And let's take a look at some Cahoots. I should have Cahoots. 141, Chapter 3A. Yes. Right here it is. Okay, good. All right. Good, I've got a place to put the winners. Give it another 10 seconds. All right. So how secure is AES 128? It's computationally secure, which is just practicality. As far as anybody knows, there is no device that can get in there without knowing the key right now. But there is no guarantee that that will not happen later. All right. What kind of security does not change as technology improves?
Information is secure. What type of security doesn't change as technology improves?
Okay, that's informationally secure, where it is so secure that no possible computer you could ever build could get in. All right. All right, how many bits of security do you get with RSA 128?
64.
128. That's the point. If your cryptographic system is very good, then there is no attack faster than a brute force attack. You really have to try all the possible passwords, and then you get 128 bits of security. And RSA 128 does accomplish that, as far as anybody knows. All right, so how long should an RSA key be for use now?
2048, 2048, 2048, 2048, 2048, 2048.
That's 2048. Now, when RSA was originally written decades ago, they planned for 512 bits, which was considered strong enough at that time. But it became popular. Most people use 1024, but now you have to be using at least 2048 or you're not considered secure even right now. All right. All right. So what cost is it large to make Ethereum more secure?
Memory.
All right, and that's memory. Ethereum is a high memory attack. All right. So I got John. You might have to tell me more than that, unless there's only one John, which I'm not sure. And Easter Bunny will have to tell me who they are. And LY, I think I know who that is. All right, so you might put your name in the chat if you care about getting points. Anyway, aha, good, okay. I see one name here, I'm gonna put it there. All right, I got Easter Bunny. John might want to give me a last name or an initial or something, but John might possibly be enough. My long-suffering creator will attempt to figure it out. Aha. How does rank work? I got all 54 right too. 54 right? Well, if you get all the questions, you're talking about the Kahoots. The Kahoots grade you not only on whether you're right, but also how quickly you get there. So you have to be in the top 3 to get points. That's how it works. So it is, yeah. All right. Anyway, so let's talk about security. How do you achieve this? So in practice, you want to, it would be nice if you could have a mathematical proof that your encryption scheme is secure. Another opportunity is to just have heuristic security, where you build attacking machines and let people attack it, and then you have evidence that many people didn't get in. This is why you have things like bug bounty programs. You publish it, you offer people a cash prize to get in, then a lot of people try, and then you say, well, it appears pretty secure because a lot of people didn't get in. And this is what RSA did. I think it was the RSA company had a whole series of these contests. They had like a 56-bit key and 64-bit key and 80-bit key and all these, and they had a cash prize for every of these. And they were up there for like 10 years. And then all these people would compete to crack in and become famous as the person that cracked it. And that's how they got some measure of how strong it was in practice. Of course, that doesn't really prove things. For all you know, there are dangerous attackers like foreign military, which have top secret programs and very fast computers like we have at the NSA, that can break in, but they aren't willing to demonstrate their capability by engaging in a public contest. So you might have a public contest and nobody gets in, and that doesn't really mean that nobody can get in. It just means that nobody that bothered to try got in. And that's the problem, of course. Anyway, so here's provable security. This is proof. What you do is you prove mathematically that breaking this system is as difficult as some other problem that is considered difficult. And that would be nice. So RSA, for example, requires factoring a number into its component primes, which has been a famous problem that nobody has found a fast way to solve for thousands of years. But there is no known way to prove that that is an intrinsically difficult problem. It is possible that somebody could find a shortcut mathematically, and then this system would no longer be secure. And you have no way to prove that can't be done. Not right now. Nobody has been able to do that in the field of theoretical mathematics, to prove that hard problems are really hard. But in practice, factoring prime numbers appears to be very hard. Nobody has published any public way to do it. And so if you have two large random numbers, P and Q, and you multiply them, in RSA, this is your public key, and you also have an exponent. And typically people just all use the same number, 65, 537, because this number does not have to be random. But n is the product of two random numbers, and you publish this public key, and in practice, nobody can figure out P and Q from that key. If you make it long enough, as we were talking about before, now the recommendation is over 3,000 bits. So that's the algorithm. Now to encrypt your message, you take your plain text message as a number, raise it to the E, the public exponent, and modulus n, which is the other part of the public key. And now you've got a different number, which you can send. And in order for the person to decrypt it, they have to raise it to the D mod n, where D is the encryption key, the decryption key. And the decryption key requires you to know P and Q. So the person who generated it knows P and Q, and they can calculate D, and now they have that. But when they publish E, nobody can figure out D from E. That's why it works. So everybody can encrypt data and send it to you because the public key is public, but nobody can read any of those messages except you because you hold P and Q. And this is a secure system where you have a private key and you never tell anybody. Now there's no key distribution problem. Having a secret where you never tell anybody is a nice, sustainable, scalable issue. Having a secret and yet you have to share the secret with somebody else, that is an intrinsically weak system. You're sending that's why private key encryption is not much use over the internet, because if I connect to an internet server, I have no way to exchange a private key with them. And this public key system is necessary to make internet commerce possible. So here's what you do. You can prove, you can't prove that hard problems are absolutely intrinsically hard, but what you can do is you can prove that one problem is as hard as another problem. And that's what we settle for as evidence. So you can derive new cryptographic schemes by proving that they're mathematically related to old ones you already trust. You can develop new symmetric algorithms or hash functions or bit generators, and you can decide how secure they are by comparing them to a known hard problem and say, well, they're as secure as this other hard problem. And that's what we are currently accepting as the state of the art in cryptography. However, it's all very insecure. You'd like to think math is like beautiful and perfect and pure, but cryptography is really not the kind of math where you find a problem. It's the kind of math where you try to make a problem hard, and the hardness is just not a very well-defined concept. So it's disturbing, if you like, how shaky the foundation is for cryptography, but we need it for the internet and so many other things. So we're using it, but the end result is we have this sort of madness where people use stuff and every few years they find a flaw. They say, oh no, you have to quit using that, move to the next one. And then they say, oh no, that one's broken too, and you have to move to the next one. And so it's not like clean or neat or tidy, but that's where we're at. So RSA, if P and Q are not completely random, then, and you're able to somehow limit the possible things to try for P or Q, that you can get in. There was a knapsack routine that was broken by lattice reduction. Another big problem is side channel attacks. By the way, all these have really happened. A large number of public keys in use on the internet turned out to be mathematically related because the random number generators were not random enough. So P and Q were in fact not random and unpredictable. And side channel attacks are a big issue. You measure some other quantity that is not in the mathematics, like you measure the radio wave emitted by the processor, or the power consumed, or the time it takes to make the key. And that's what that attack earlier, bunny attack or whatever, that turtle or whatever, some animal attack that came out, the squirrel or something. And that was in fact a timing attack. Since they dropped leading zeros, the time it takes to do encryption was different if the leading digits were zero than if it wasn't. And from that, they were able to deduce information about the key. And of course, the most common error, and the reason why I teach this course, is people just do not choose the right cryptographic system to use. And this is what I find in more than half of the Android apps I audit. They use symmetric cryptography where they needed to use asymmetric cryptography, which is a really serious flaw. And that's what happens all the time. People just do not correctly implement cryptography because they just don't understand what's going on, and they make something sort of scrambled. So when it's audited, whatever security audit they're doing is being done by someone who also doesn't know much cryptography. So they just look at it, it's not readable anymore, and they say, well, it's good enough, but it's not. So then there's heuristic security. And this is, like I say, most ciphers don't have a security proof at all. Like AES. AES just has a bunch of operations, and it's not related to any famous hard problem like factoring prime numbers. All it is designed to stop all the known attacks, and that's it. So skilled people have tried to break it and failed. That's heuristic, for what it's worth. And so you have a security margin. In order to rate how secure something is, you have a version of it that you're going to use that nobody can get in, and then you make a weaker version that somebody can get in, and then you have some way of measuring the difference between the strong version and the weak version. So for things like AES, it has 10 rounds of computation. And so you find you can crack, say, 2 or 3 rounds, and you say, well, I've got these extra rounds. That's how big the security margin is. So AES has 3 versions with 128 bit key, 192, and 256 key. And so the idea, of course, is that the 128 would be the weakest, but still very strong, and the 192 would be stronger, and the 256 would be stronger again. But it turned out they found some attacks, which meant you don't have to try all the keys. Now, AES 128 really has, as far as anybody knows, 128 bits of security. But 256 and 192 were broken, so that 192 really only has 176, and 256 only has 119 bits. It's, in fact, less secure than AES 128 because of this attack. So that's none of these, all these numbers are over 100, which means there's no way to get in right now, but they all didn't quite turn out to be as secure as the original plan was. And by the way, the attack they found here was against 11 rounds of AES 256 instead of 14 rounds. So the full AES does not have this fast attack of 2 to the 119. And so that's some measure of your security margin. It's all very disturbing and unconvincing. It's not beautiful like you would like math to be. All right, so then you have to generate keys. Now, you could make a random key by just rolling dice or something. You're using a random number generator, or you could derive it from a password, which is what's commonly done for things like hard disk encryption. Now, the problem there, of course, is passwords are not really random. People often choose band names and the name of their dog and their birthday and obvious things like that. So if the password is a guessable word, then the actual number of possible keys is much smaller than you think it is. So that's one issue. But anyway, it is common that people want to type in a password and you derive a key from the password. And then you can have a key agreement protocol, where like Diffie-Hellman, where you send messages over a network and somehow agree on a key at each end. Those are various ways to generate keys, where I generate some of the bits of a key essentially, and somebody else generates some other bits, and we combine those together so we end up with a key that we have both contributed some information to. So simple random numbers for symmetric keys like AES, they're just random numbers. There's no bad numbers. You just have a series of random bits. So if you make a 16-byte number, that's 128 bits, and you have 128-bit security. So that's an example of a 128-bit key. But asymmetric keys are much more complicated. That number is not just random. For RSA, it's the multiple of 2 prime numbers. So in fact, it takes thousands of times longer to calculate than a symmetric key. You have to first find a prime number that's really long, and then you have to find another prime number. And there is in fact no certain way to find a prime number. What you do, there are tests that are statistical in nature. There's a test that has like a 50% chance of detecting if a number is not prime. So you guess a random number and you run that test like 10 or 100 times. And after that, you're fairly confident this number is prime. Then you do it again. Now you have found 2 numbers that you are fairly confident they're prime. Now you encrypt something and decrypt it, and that tells you that they really are prime and it works. Now you've got a prime number, and that turns out to take a long time. So I'm not going to do it live, but if you generate a 2048-bit key, it actually takes several seconds. And 4096 and 8192, this gets down to taking like a minute or 2 on a modern computer. It really has to do a lot of work to generate that key. Whereas AES keys just pop right out like that because it just has to generate some random bits. So that's the game. So once you're done creating a key, you now have a private key that you have to store somewhere. And your computer has to be able to get at it to read your data. But if you just put it on your hard drive in a file, somebody might steal it. So you typically protect your key by wrapping it with a second key that you generate from a password. And if you use like PGP, you'll have a RSA key, and it's got a password, and you have to type in the password to unlock your key. And this is true of password management systems like what I use. I use LastPass, and so I have to put in a master password to open my vault, and then my passwords are stored in there. And that's the same kind of thing. This is protecting your key by wrapping it with another key. All right. And so you can also store it on a hardware token. This is what a lot of two-factor authentications use. You have this USB token like a YubiKey. So there's the fact that you physically have to have the hardware is what protects you. And it also is typically wrapped in a password as well. You have to put in the key and then type in something like a PIN. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. You can have a mathematical error. RSA OAEP was supposedly proven, but the proof was incorrect. They found a mathematical flaw in the correct. Now it was in the proof. It turned out that the flaw was not severe enough to completely get in. This, by the way, is sort of true of WPA. WPA was the improvement over WEP, but WPA turned out to have some mathematical flaws. So there are certain things you can do with WPA encryption that you're not supposed to be able to do. But it turns out that there is no known way to really break all the way in. You're just able to do a couple of things that really aren't right, but they aren't not enough errors that make it possible to have a really fast attack that will really get you in like WEP. And the same thing was true of this RSA system. It turned out to be not as good as it should have been, but there was not a complete shattering where you could really get in without the key. And then, of course, another huge problem is legacy systems. This is probably, in my opinion, the #1 problem in all cryptography is incompetence. People just making stupid systems because they don't understand it. But the next huge problem is legacy systems. They're using old stuff because time is our enemy. People keep on using stuff and then they keep on discovering ways in and having to change it. So if you have a network where you've got old machines mixed with new machines, you typically have to speak some old protocols. And so this is why the cryptographers really get mad at the US government. The US government keeps trying to classify cryptographic systems as military secrets and then limit where they go. So they developed until throughout the 1990s, they made it illegal to export powerful cryptography to other nations because they didn't want the other nations being able to send secrets that our military couldn't read. And so you could make computer systems, but you could only distribute them to friendly nations. And in order to go to unfriendly nations, you had to use export-grade cryptography, which was weak that the NSA could read it. And this meant if you wanted to put up a website and have that website be visible in Iran and China and stuff, you had to speak export-grade encryption because the American-made machines they were using in those other countries, unless they were obtained illegally, could not use modern encryption protocols. So now you had to have many ciphers available on the server, modern ciphers that are secure, and export-grade ciphers that are incredibly insecure, like 512-bit RSA. Now, we were saying even 2048-bit RSA is beginning to worry people. 512 is really not good. And so this meant your website would sometimes serve things up using old broken encryption. And therefore, that's a serious weakness because I can meddle with traffic and make it think that you're an old machine, and then it will use the old broken protocol. So that's one of the many problems. And there's a whole series of attacks that are just ways of tricking servers into using the old protocols. The security experts are very angry about this. It would be much better to make a machine that always uses strong encryption. It is very disturbing to have an insecure option that you use. And this is why if you install a Windows domain controller, they will ask you when you install it, do you want a native domain controller or a legacy compatible domain controller? The best thing is always to make a native domain controller. So if you installed Windows Server 2016, all your machines have to be Server 2016 or later, and now it will use the latest and best encryption. But if you wanted to back operate with Windows 2000 domain controllers or Windows NT domain controllers, then it has to accept really old protocols that are not that safe. All right, anyway. All right, how did North Korea attack digital film database? Well, I don't think anybody really knows. North Korea attacked and leaked some movie that was pretty famous. And I don't think I ever heard any complete description of how they did it. It's a good question. If anybody finds out, I would like to know. But they did blame it on North Korea. And in fact, the last I heard, a lot of people weren't even believing it was really North Korea that did it. The NSA claimed they had proof of that, but they did not release the information. So yeah, the interview was the movie, yeah. And they also, and there were a lot of people that had what they thought was pretty convincing arguments that it was not North Korea. But then the US government said, we're sure it's North Korea, but we're not going to show you the evidence. And that's the last I heard of it. So the details of how it happened are not public information as far as I know. That's true of an awful lot of security breaches. An interesting breach happens, and yet we never really publicly find out exactly what happened. Somebody made a big argument based on the time of the attack, claiming it couldn't have been North Korea and had to be an insider or something, but I think that wasn't very credible. But anything that happens between nation states hits military secrecy. And so we never really get the facts. And whatever information does come out is very likely to be a false cover story. So, you know, the public information about military activities is always very incomplete. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right, let's see what we got here. I don't know if anybody got fired over that one in Sony. Anyway, so what property means that experts have failed to crack a system? That's heuristic security, the kind you get from, say, a bug bounty program. All right, what number has to be kept secret? All right, P is the prime number, and that has to be secret, and an E are the public key. Those do not have to be kept secret. Okay, what system converts a password into a key? All right, that's a key derivation function. All right. And what's the operation that protects a key with a password? All right, that's called key wrapping. All right, so we record the winners here. And Stacy. And all right, Juarez. And Easter Bunny, I already know who that is. Good. All right. So I've got the winners. All right. And I don't think I am planning to demonstrate projects today. I just want to point out where we are because I have added the extra credit points to all these projects. So a lot of these projects, there's part that you required and then there's extra credit part. So you don't have to do the extra credit part, but if you do, it adds to your total points. And almost all of them have extra portions. And the one that last time we talked about this up to, I think, the 2-time pad. And I just thought I'd mention this one, the row method, because people were asking about this, and there's 2 fun things to say about this. So if you want to find a collision in a hash function, for example, MD5, you put it in a file, you hash it, you get a number. There should be no other file that hashes to the same number. But in practice, that file must exist, but those numbers, it should be so rare that you can't find it. And so it turns out the way to solve this is the Pollard's row technique. You just hash the file, then you hash it again, hash the result, hash it over and over again. And what will happen is you'll get different values, and eventually you'll have a collision where hashing one leads back to a number you've seen before, and then you're stuck in this ring. So this means you can actually find it by just calculating a series of hashes. You don't need to remember them all. You'll eventually notice that you're seeing the same numbers over and over if you remember any of the ones in the past. And so you can see this happen. So here's the starting project where you just do this a few times and see it go. And I just added a couple more projects here to make this more practical because I've been doing the more advanced challenges at CryptoHack, and I have been trying to up my game to actually solve the really hard ones here, which I have not solved yet. So that's Pollard's row, where you can see a duplicate hash function. And if you go down to the math section, here's a couple of more techniques to crack these things. And these are attacking the discrete logarithm problem. So here is baby step, giant step. Now we're trying to crack the discrete logarithm problem. So we have g to the y, we know a generator g, and we know a value x. And we want to find an integer y. So when you raise g to the y, modulus p, you get x. If there were normal numbers, then you could just reverse it with a logarithm. But in a ring, this is a hard problem. Let's see, in practice, would that chain of hash be really long? Yes, let me go back to that. That's a very important question. In practice, this ring is not as long as you think it would be. It turns out that if your total number of possible hash values is n, you only have to do the square root of n steps before the ring will hit a cycle. That's why this is so powerful. That's why finding a hash collision is much easier than finding a hash equal to a specific value. And that's the fundamental trick here. And so the baby step, giant step is how you try these things. And the point here is you do it in 2 stages. you break your number up into a certain number of, m is the square root of the prime. So you break your quantity into a certain number of square root units and another number you add. These are the giant steps and those are the baby steps. And then you crack each of those separately. So what you've done is take a problem that's big that you can't solve, like 2 to the 64 possibilities, and you break it up into 2 problems that are each much smaller, like 2 to the 32. That's typically how you do it. That's the general philosophy of like a meet in the middle attack. You take an impossible problem and break it up into 2 chunks, which are both possible. And so here's the algorithm. You calculate all the baby steps. This one is a time memory trade-off. You calculate the baby steps and you save them all in a table. So they're pre-calculated. Then you do the giant steps and find out which giant step gets you close, and then you find the baby steps to get there. So this is a way to do it. This is a way to get to the end without trying all possible values. And that's one technique. The problem with this one is it takes a lot of memory. And the next one is Pollard's row, and it took me a whole week to get this working. And like I say, these are even beyond your textbook and stuff. So these are for people who are willing to go a little further into math. But the point is, you're trying to solve the digital logarithm problem the same. We're trying to find the exponent here that will give you a number, and that's hard. That would require trying all possible values. But what you do is instead you settle for finding a collision, just 2 numbers that are equal. And that works because you have this Pollard's row situation. And in order to do it without having to remember a whole table of all the values, like in the baby step, giant step, you use the tortoise and the hare. You calculate the value and then you iterate again and again and again, and you have 2 things. The tortoise goes 1 step at a time, and the hare goes 2 steps at a time. And they race. The hare goes faster, and so the hare goes up here and starts going around the loop. Then eventually the tortoise catches up and they hit, and now you have 2 values that hash to the same thing. The hare has had more repetitions than the other, so now you have 2 quantities. You created a hash collision. And the whole problem is approximately going to take square root of the number of calculations, square root of p, square root of the maximum size of it. So that's one easy problem, is the tortoise and hare problem. And then there's another problem. After you do the race, and you find the collision, then there's another problem here where you deduce the number from this, and that also can be done in the square root of n times. So it's another way of breaking it into 2 small chunks that are solvable, but you do not have to have a huge table of the size square root of n. So this one, the baby step, giant step, is a meet in the middle attack, but it is memory hard. If you have 64 bits to crack, you're going to need 2 to the 32 computations, and you're going to need 2 to the 32 bytes of memory. But this one just has 2 to the 32 calculations a couple of times, and you don't need to have a lot of memory. So anyway, both of them are good. And so I was trying to crack a 64-bit key to do that. And I finally got this running, but even doing the best I can, it's going to take 2 days. It's running in the background. I see I've gotten up to like 16 million guesses, and I need to get up to 2,000 million guesses. So yeah, I predict it's going to take 2 days to find the answer. But anyway, so there's some projects if you want to do this. The only one that I did last semester was this row method, and I've been adding these new ones as I move forward with the cool stuff at CryptoHack. But that's the basic one, is the row method, and all the rest of that stuff is extra credit if you're interested in getting into more of this. But I am very interested. I'd like to really get all these things working. All right. So I think I'm going to stop the recording, but I'll stick around to answer questions.